Hi, anyone and everyone. Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam.
And my name is Kelly.
Today I have a little bit more of a history lesson for you. We're going to go back to the 1800s and talk about the Couch tomb in Lincoln Park in Chicago. But before we get into it, Kelly, what is our question for today?
Okay, so I saw our intro and we chatted a little tiny bit about this one up there, just a little bit. So I knew it involved Lincoln Park a bit, and I live sort of right here. And I was wondering, have you ever been to Lincoln Park? Do you have a favorite Lincoln Park memory?
Um, I've definitely been to Lincoln Park.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of memory. Well, always the zoo. The zoo's always great.
You're right.
Like,
The zoo is great.
you can't go wrong with
Yes.
the zoo. Um,
Yeah. It's
I've not,
attached right to Lincoln Park proper
and it's
for
free,
our
and it's great.
Yeah, it is great. It's a great zoo. I don't often go there during the day because sometimes zoos make me sad.
Yeah, they
But
can.
I always go. They can, right? I always go for the zoo lights,
I love the zoo
right?
lights.
Yes,
Yeah, that's when they
the Christmas
cover
season.
Lincoln Park Zoo in all incredible variation of holiday lights. And so you basically get to
Yes,
wander
and
the zoo and watch a light show, and it's
mhm,
really cool.
yeah, it's really fun. Yeah, and they have like the around Christmas they have the music synced up to the light show, so the lights will
hmm
flash. And I always say, I'm like, well, it's not Christmas until I've heard "All I Want for Christmas Is You," of course. And the one time I hadn't heard it, went to the zoo lights. I've got my mulled wine, which is always like whatever wine they haven't been able to sell, and they've
Right.
heated it up, and you're just at a point where you're like, it's so cold, that looks good. And so I ended up hearing it there for the first time and saw it like linked to a light show, and I was like,
hmm
this is great. Like
Yeah,
it
one
was
year, a handful of years ago, my aunt and I went up to um, the botanical gardens up in, I think, Highland
ooh,
Park.
another.
And then
Yeah.
they had like a miniature train exhibit for the holidays. And then that night we went down to Zoo Lights, and it was just like
Oh
full
my gosh.
festive. Like, we were
Yeah.
both adults. We just wanted
But
to
oh, it
go.
doesn't matter.
This was
Yeah,
just a couple years
exactly.
ago. But it was
Hmm.
so festive and fun, and it was really fun seeing all the families there. So yeah,
Oh
Zoo
yeah.
Lights is great. It's so much fun.
Yeah. I was gonna say, like, that's one of the ones we can all land on collectively. I
Right?
think they're awesome
The
because
only issue
it's
is the
nighttime.
parking. Getting there and parking
Yeah,
is a
yeah,
nightmare.
that's true. That's true. But such is the case with a lot of joints in
That's
Chicago.
true.
It's like the worst part about it is the parking.
So there's a lot of times I won't go to things if I can't park.
Right? Yeah. It's like, where do we park? Nowhere. Okay. Well, not doing that
Yeah, I
because
need to plan out
um
my trip based on parking.
right, exactly. Yeah, because you're like, what? I'm gonna drive 35 minutes and then go nowhere? No.
Right. 35 minutes. You're not getting far in Chicago in 35 minutes.
No, exactly. You're not getting far. You're not getting far, and you're still, excuse me, you're still finding a spot where there's no parking.
Right. Or you're paying $100 for it.
Exactly. Yes, or you're paying a whole load of money. I mean, it's better than a home Cubs game parking, but still,
Not much.
not much. Yeah, not very much.
All right, but let's go ahead and dive into today's case.
All right.
And
Yeah, I want to hear more.
we're diving deep into Chicago's history. And I felt like I needed to do something a little less gruesome because some of the cases I've been covering are
Yeah.
just very sad or very gruesome. And it's not
Oh yeah.
necessarily that this isn't going to be sad because there is going to be a lot of death that we're going to talk about, but it is not in the same way.
Yes.
So let's start with Ira Couch. Ira was born on November 11th, 1806 in New York. And we don't really know much about his parents or his childhood, but we do know that he had an older brother. His brother's name was James, and he was born in 1800.
Okay.
So in 1836, Ira and James moved to Chicago together. At this time, Ira was a licensed tailor who had an eye for business. Both Ira and James decided to open up a store that sold different sorts of finishings and tailoring supplies. And the store was on the corner of Lake and Dearborn. So we're kind of, for those of you who are familiar with Chicago, this is just south of the river in the northeast corner of what's kind of currently called the Loop. And
Right downtown where all the trains turn around.
And at the time, this was kind of the edge of Chicago. Chicago was a very, very small city at this point. So according to encyclopedia.chicagohistory.org in
1837.
In 1837, the population of Chicago was around 4,000 people. So very small.
Yeah, we were so small. 1837, we were tiny.
But then when it got to the point of 1890, just about 50 years later, it was the third largest city with over 1 million people. So it grew very fast.
That sounds close. I was going to say, that was really fast, and that sounds closer.
Right. Yeah, but 50 years.
Definitely not 4,000.
A very short period of time to gain nearly 1 million people.
Yeah. That's such a short time.
Yeah, there were two cities that were ahead of Chicago in their population at 1890. So we were the third largest city at that point. The other two cities were New York and Philadelphia.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
What I like New York, I got, but I'm thinking like what other city at that point? Because we weren't that far west population wise yet. Like that,
Yeah,
I knew that
exactly.
grew after. But the growth of the city is incredibly fascinating to me with just how fast it all happened. And starting in 1837, this was actually the first year Chicago would be considered a city. It incorporated at that point.
Okay.
So then jumping ahead to 1860, the population grew to 109,000. So 37 to 60 grew about 105,000 people.
Yeah.
And then the Chicago fire burned the majority of the city. And while it's still a lot, the population kept growing. But it did slow, and there were a lot of people who fled because of the fire, and 300 people died from the fire. So even though like the people left, it still grew, just not quite as rapidly in those following years.
Sort of kind of burnt out a few people. Totally understand.
Yeah. And just kind of a fun side note fact, the name Chicago comes from the Algonquin tribe, and it actually means smelly onion. So, just fun fact for people out there.
That's interesting.
Well, Chicago was
got to
originally a
rename it
lot of
now.
marshland, and it stunk.
Yeah, they were like, it stinks.
Let's say it accurately described Chicago early on.
Right. And all of us showed up and we were like, we should make a city here.
Right.
And they were like, why?
So 9 years after the fire, in 1880, the population of Chicago grew to 503,000 people. So we added another 400,000 in the 9 years after the fire.
Right. That's a lot of people. In
So
only
much
9
people.
years. That's so many people. Yeah, like, oh, God.
And then within 10 years after that, to the 1890 mark, when we hit the million, we doubled that population. So it went from 500,000 in 1880 to 1 million in 1890. I'm just like, this
Ooh,
all
we
blew me
doubled,
away
yeah.
when I was
Yeah,
researching.
we doubled down and just, the first one, the first marker of 1880, only 9 years after the fire.
And for our purposes in this whole story, we're going to really be sticking to the 1800s through most of this episode. But just to note, by 1910, the population had doubled again to 2.2 million.
Ooh.
So
Yeah.
it's crazy how fast the city grew. And it was I think considered the fastest growing city in the country.
That would make sense. Seeing these numbers, that would make sense.
Yeah, well,
and people are starting to kind of come westward a little more.
That's exactly what I was about to say. The westward expansion was really happening when it came to the cities out there, and people had to come this way to get there. So this either became a stopping place for people for a little bit, and before they continued out there, or people just chose to stay here.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, some people might have just come here and been like, we were supposed to go all the way to California, but do you guys want to just hang it up and start a new life here? And
yeah, I'm sick of traveling. This place looks cool.
Yeah. They're like, wait, we already moved. We've been walking a while. I'm already tired. Let's just chill here.
Yeah, why not?
That's definitely what I would have done. That's definitely what I would have done. I don't have the strength of character to make it to California.
That's a long trip at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Too long.
So Ira and James open up their shop, and the shop seems like it's a great success. Ira was a licensed tailor, so he already had Ira was a licensed tailor, but he really had a mind for business, and he had a lot bigger ideas that he wanted to do. And within a year, he actually chose to sell the shop, and he purchased a hotel, the Tremont House, which was basically right next door to the shop that he owned. And it was built just 4 years earlier. So it was still a new business, but it was originally considered a rooming house. And this is actually where James and Ira were living at the time.
Oh, okay.
And Ira had the intention of turning it into a hotel. Okay. So a rooming house initially is just like an affordable option for single adults. And many customers of rooming houses often were struggling financially. And the rooms in the rooming houses would be rented out by the day, and they'd share common rooms. So you'd all share like a kitchen, bathroom, and a living room, but you'd have your own place to sleep.
Okay, yeah.
And Ira wanted to completely rebrand and actually turned the Tremont House into Chicago's first hotel.
Okay, that might be, when you said the Tremont House, I'm like, why do I recognize that name? I think there might even still be one open, or maybe I've heard it somewhere.
Yeah, so I was a little confused.
Don't know.
Well, it came from Boston. So the name that they chose, the Tremont House, was actually a place in Boston that they named here as well. It was a little confusing because it was the Tremont House for a very, very long time. It still might be the Tremont House because this still exists in Chicago. Was gonna say. But I went to the website, and the website's Tremont House, but it's under a different name of the hotel. So I think the hotel kind of renamed itself throughout the years.
And I think that happens a lot in that downtown loop area with the hotels.
A new company buys it, it slightly changes, but you want to keep the historical stuff.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So the previous owner, his name was Doran, he owned it only for a couple of months. People didn't really like him.
I was going to say, we didn't like him.
Honestly, it kind of sounds like he was very much a pushover from what I've read. He struggled to get tenants to pay their rent. And The tenants at one point actually rebelled against him.
Oh
And
no.
according to Chicagoology, the tenants all got together and basically accosted Darwin and said that they wouldn't pay. And he's trying to defend
Okay.
himself, saying, like, there's expenditures. Like, I need you guys to pay to
Right.
keep it open. Like, I owe
I'm gonna need you.
money.
Yeah.
And I,
Yeah, I'm gonna
from,
need you to
like, you gotta do
gonna
it.
need you to pay that. Yeah, you gotta do that. It's very much giving Rent right now, the
Right.
musical. Like, no, you have to. That's not how Rent works. You've got it. The thing is, you've got it.
Yeah, and so, like, it sounds like he wasn't defending himself well from the article that I read,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
he was phrasing it in a way of, like, I have debts and I need you to pay so I can pay my debts, versus
Uh-huh.
I need to pay for you to live here.
Yeah, and run the hotel, like,
Yeah.
hence Rent.
So his tenants accosted him, said, "No, we're not going to pay." And he then was talking to one of his friends just kind of about this whole situation, and his friend's like, "You know what? Like, just try to sell. Like, pass it
Yeah.
off to somebody else. If you sell,
Yeah.
you can at least pay your own debt. Somebody else can deal with the bad tenants." And
True.
that's basically what he did. That's when Ira Couch came involved, and he bought it. And the moment he stepped in, he put his foot down. He said, like, you all are paying or you're out. Like, zero
Or
in
yeah,
between.
yeah.
Like, this is a business. You're not getting away with
Yeah.
this anymore.
Yeah.
So he paid the debt that was inherited through buying it, and got the
Right.
tenants to start paying or got them out. And it wasn't long before the reputation of the Tremont would greatly improve, and it actually became a staple for traveling businessmen.
All right. Go Ira and James.
Right? So the building was 3 stories tall, and just like much of Chicago, it was built from wood. And knowing what we know about Chicago in the mid 1800s, a wood foundation and structures were high risk for fires. And the Tremont is no exception to this. In fact,
no.
it would burn and be rebuilt many times.
Oh no.
Say, this is not a surprise. Like, if you know Chicago history,
Yeah,
this is
yeah.
quite frequent.
Yeah, whatever you build, if you have heard Chicago history, whatever you build is going to immediately burn down, so you should just buy double whatever you were going to buy to build it.
Right. The first fire was in 1839, just a couple years after Ira purchased the hotel.
Oh no.
Ira rebuilt it. And he actually rebuilt it on a neighboring lot. So it's kind of like kitty corner from where it originally was. And construction was completed very fast. It was only about 6 months. Completed in
wow.
1840. And the hotel quickly gained popularity again and became the top destination for most travelers. And it had a good location. Being in like that corner of the loop, it's such easy access to anywhere in the city at that point.
Absolutely. Even now, that's a great location.
Right?
Because you just have such good access, like you said.
And things would operate pretty normally until 1849, when the Tremont would burn down again.
Oh no.
Again, it would be rebuilt.
Again.
Finally,
No.
they got rid of the wood. They brought in bricks.
Okay. Okay, there we go.
Say that's a big difference here. It's finally bringing in something that's a bit more fire resistant.
Right, exactly. We're trying to get a little more fire resistant.
So then by October 1850, the third version would be built. Again, became a hot spot for Chicago. But just a couple years later, in 1853, Ira would choose to sell the Tremont.
Oh,
At this point, he was a millionaire. in
Oh.
the mid 1800s. He was an actual millionaire. And
Wow. Okay, so I see why he sold now.
yeah, he didn't need it. It wasn't
He
necessary
didn't need,
anymore.
no, he didn't need it. He was like, I'm not going to keep rebuilding that hotel.
Yeah, and it would continue to
$1 million, it's 1800.
yeah, no need for that at this point. And that would have been
Yeah.
the conversion rate around this time, because I was looking a lot of this up. It was around $1 was equal to about 35, I think.
Woo!
So that's
A lot
being
of money. So
having
that's a
$1
lot.
million, which he was a multi-millionaire from my understanding. That would have been over $36,000
Yeah. Woo!
to just have 1 million, and I think he had a few.
To just 1 million. Yeah, I was gonna say to get called a millionaire, I think you.
Yeah, you don't have
I
just
think
one.
you have to have more than one. I think you. Yeah, I think you have more than one.
So,
I wouldn't know.
right? I'm not close to that.
I have no idea. Yeah.
The Tremont would continue to be known as an elite hotel with the new owners, and in 1858, Abraham Lincoln would announce his Senate campaign from the hotel.
Oh, okay. This is starting to be why maybe I know it. Okay.
It has a ton of history, even beyond Ira Couch.
Right.
That becomes
Makes
very
sense.
important to Chicago. So yeah, Lincoln announced his campaign. He also used the hotel as campaign headquarters during the Republican convention in 1860. Eventually, John Drake would own the Tremont, and John Drake also owned the Drake Motel and the Blackstone
Oh, okay.
Hotel. So like
Okay.
big deals in
Yeah,
Chicago
yeah.
hotel history going on here.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I was gonna say the Drake. It's still
Drake
yeah.
and Blackstone still
Yeah.
are around downtown.
Still a thing. Yeah.
And in 1871, during the Chicago fire, the hotel would burn down again. And it would be rebuilt once more. But this is long after Ira Couch sold the hotel at this point. So as I mentioned, at this time, Ira is a millionaire. He had gotten married and had a daughter. And after the Tremont, I couldn't really find too many details on Ira's life. It appears that he may have returned to New York or minimally visited frequently. I did see reports that he owned many properties across the Chicago area. He kind of became a real estate mogul at this point, from the
Yeah.
sound of it. Just kind of
Yeah.
to keep up a constant kind of income, even though he doesn't really need it. It's kind of
Right.
where he could step away and still make money.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. I understand. You want that to keep flowing in. Once you get a taste of that lifestyle, you probably want that to keep coming in.
Yeah, and
That
this is
makes
how
sense,
he
you
got
know?
his wealth. Like, this is something he's probably
Yeah.
been working on for decades. And
Yeah, yeah.
in 1857, Ira traveled to Cuba with his family for a tropical vacation. And it sounds like they were living in New York at this time, because Ira's daughter would kind of reference leaving New York to go to Cuba.
Okay.
But while they were on vacation, Ira became ill, and it was believed he had gotten the common cold that escalated, and Ira would actually die after becoming sick at age 50.
Wow.
So Ira's body would be returned to Chicago, where his funeral would take place. And at the time of his death, Ira was believed to be the second wealthiest person in Chicago.
Woo, yep.
I'll say,
That
it doesn't
makes
surprise
sense.
me with what we've learned.
That tracks. Mm-hmm.
So, why are we talking about Ira Couch? If you have been to Lincoln Park along LaSalle and Clark, kind of near the Chicago History Museum, you will see the beautiful park. It'll lead you to the Lincoln Park Zoo, but you will also see something that's kind of seemingly out of place, and it is a large mausoleum. And this mausoleum is Couch's tomb.
Oh.
It was left behind after the graves had been removed from the area to make room for a park, because this was originally a cemetery.
Oh. You know what? I've heard it. I think we've kind of crossed paths with that knowledge in the podcast at some point. We were like,
We may
Lincoln
have.
Park used to be a cemetery? It did used to be a cemetery.
I'd say
It
maybe during
pings
like
for me.
the Resurrection Mary episode or something.
Yeah. It pings for me. It
I'd say
did
I've
used to
known
be a
this for years.
cemetery.
I learned this on a haunted bus tour I took like 15 years ago. So this is one that's always kind of like been in the back of my head where I'm like, I need to look up more about this tomb and figure it
Right,
out.
exactly, yeah. Yeah.
But the tomb was designed by John Van Ostel, and he is also one of the people who designed one of the rebuilds for the Tremont House. He also designed the Palmer House downtown, another
Oh.
very high-end hotel. And
Yes.
apparently this tomb cost $7,000 in 1857, which in today's money is about $250,000.
Excuse me, I am allergic to spending that much money.
Right? So I'm not going to get into all the details because we have a lot of other things to talk about, but there was an ugly legal battle regarding Ira's wealth and his estate. His daughter, Caroline, actually never received any of her inheritance as promised in Ira's will. She would
Oh my gosh.
basically take the rest of her family and her father's business partners and his advisors to court, saying, like, where's my money? I got nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
He's supposedly
Yeah,
this
what's
millionaire. Where is it? And
Yeah.
this actually would go all the way to the Supreme Court. And
Oh, wow.
Ira would create a will before his death, about 2 years before his death. And in his will, Caroline was supposed to receive a trust that Ira had set up for her 20 years after his death. This would be because she was still very young when he wrote the will. She was 10 when he wrote it and 12 when he passed away. And unfortunately, the money that Caroline was supposed to inherit was used to rebuild many of the properties that was owned by the Ira estate after the Chicago fire in 1871, which left nothing in that trust for Caroline.
Oh my gosh.
And so she didn't know any of this until it went to court. And
Right.
unfortunately, Caroline would die before the Supreme Court would make their ruling. And after her death, her husband tried to fight on her behalf. But since she was not awarded part of the estate at the time of her death, she was unable to will the estate to him or their children. So it basically left him with no rights to fight for it.
Wow. Oh, that sucks.
Yeah, and that's the kind of lightest debriefing I could give you. This case goes into a lot of depth of the court proceedings of what happened and who was fighting for what, because there's a lot of people involved in it. But that's kind of the general gist of it, where unfortunately she received nothing. The money seemed to essentially like disappear after the fire because so much had to be paid.
I was gonna say, yeah, it just disappeared.
So during this whole legal battle, it also became known, it became essentially public knowledge that Ira's brother, James, actually had very little involvement and was not equal partners with Ira in his business ventures. In reality, he had no equity in the business. And during the 1891 Supreme Court trial, James was awarded nothing outside of what Ira offered in his will, despite the two brothers working together for years. Like he got it was equal parts shared between Ira's wife, his kids, or his daughter, because he only had one daughter, James, and another business partner. It was just equal. James didn't get anything more, despite being by his side for all of those years.
Yeah, wow.
And James would die just a year after the Supreme Court ruling in 1892, when James was 91. And he died because he was trying to get onto a streetcar and he fell and got run over by a truck.
Damn.
Like, so
Wow.
tragic as 91.
Wow, yeah, can you imagine? That's my greatest fear of driving in Chicago, is
Oh, it's
hitting
awful,
anybody.
right?
And you're like, oh my God, I just hit a 91-year-old man. Oh, Jesus. Also, talk about differences as far as the brothers dying.
Right?
Both of them, yeah, they couldn't have died opposite ways
No,
more if they
exactly.
tried.
So let's get back to the couch tomb and where the cemetery sat. To do that, I feel like I need to mention Pamela Banos. She did research that is incredibly vital to today's episode. Pamela, who's a local artist, took the task of finding out the historical truth of Chicago's city cemetery and not just rely on the retold stories.
Ooh.
Her website, which I'm going to link in the show notes, it's incredible. Like, I've spent so many hours on her website because there's so much information, and there's photos of historical documents and newspapers, and then she just kind of breaks every piece of this down. I there's so much. It was so much fun to go through.
Yeah.
But on her page, on her kind of about me section on her website, she says, I'm an artist who is interested in how to find things and how things are not always as they appear. I am curious about the ways that images and places represent layers of information. And I just love that. I feel like that's such a perfect description of my interests in this as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
I agree.
It's just
very
it
interested.
words it very beautifully, where it's like it's layers of information.
Yeah.
It's like you learn something and then you dig
Yeah.
deeper and you find something new and then you dig a little bit more.
Yes. Yes. And then there's a new thread, and then there's a new thread, and all of a sudden you're like, I've spun out my whole couch blanket.
Right?
I can't be contacted for the rest of the day.
Like, I feel like that's kind of why we started the podcast. Like, because we're interested in
Yeah.
finding those things. So I wanted to point that out because
I
I thought
agree.
that was very well written. And
It's very well written. You can tell the person who wrote it is an artist.
and we're going to mention her a lot through this episode because her website was so in depth with her research and citing her research and showing the historical documentations, like actual photos of it. It's incredible.
Right. That's awesome.
Yeah, and we're also only scratching the surface. So if this is something that interests you, I highly recommend checking it out. I did see, I haven't listened to it yet, but I know that there are a few podcast episodes about some of her research and kind of what she's done. I'm definitely going to follow up and listen to those.
Yeah.
But go check it out. It's going to be in our links in our show sources. It's called Hidden Truths, Pamela Banos. So if any of you are interested, I highly, highly recommend it.
Very interested. I'll probably check it out after we finish recording.
I'd say there's so much, like, I can't even explain to you how much information is in her site, because you'll like click on one page and then in her description she'll be like, click here for more, and it'll lead you to another page. But then
no.
you have to like go back because there's tabs on every page too, so you need to like click through every tab. There's so much information.
A good old-fashioned rabbit hole.
Oh my god, I loved it. I had so much fun on that website.
Oh my gosh. I would too. A good old-fashioned Chicago history rabbit hole. I'd be like, talk to me, text me tomorrow. I'm busy.
Right. So the land where the tomb sits is what was the site of Chicago City Cemetery. In 1837, the land where the tomb sits, which is currently Lincoln Park, kind of the south end of Lincoln Park, was given to Chicago for use as a graveyard. And this is the same year Chicago became incorporated. And at this point, that land was the furthest northern part of the city. So like the populous part of the city was south of here because they wanted
Right.
cemeteries and graveyards to not be close to the general population.
Yeah. Yeah. That would make sense to me.
Previously, there were two different areas that were used as graveyards on both the north and south ends of the city. And the northernmost one, which now is located about 10 blocks south of this new city cemetery that they're building, it was on Oak Street. So it really wasn't far from this
No.
new cemetery they
No.
were making. And
yeah, that's not far at all.
yeah, not far at all. And then the southernmost cemetery graveyard was on 23rd Street. So if you know Chicago, you know that these two locations really are not that far from each other.
No.
And this kind of shows you really how small Chicago was at that time. Like we were saying, it was about 4,000 people.
Yeah.
But as we know from our previous conversation, the city is about to grow very fast. And in turn, when the city grows fast, so do the number of deaths. You just have more people with the ability to die in the city. And they had to accommodate with more space.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And so,
That seems fair.
right? The city is given this land in 1837, but it actually isn't able to start using it until late 1842 to early 1843. There just seemed to be a lot of I'm not sure if it was necessarily permitting issues, but kind of a lot of legal issues that prevented them from using it for a while. And
Okay.
I know a lot of it had to do with money. Obviously
wow.
the city was paying for the land, but there was just a lot of other things in between there as well that it took a handful of years to get it to be a functional cemetery. And once they started to get all of the permitting and payments all worked out, they started burials in 1843. And at this time, they stopped burials at the Oak Street and 23rd Street cemeteries because they were no longer allowed to be used.
Okay.
And once operations truly begun, the city wanted to move the graves from those two previous cemeteries to City Cemetery. And this process took a few years. And then in addition to the growing population of the city, aka increased number of deaths, City Cemetery needed more space. So they purchased an additional 12 acres of land adjacent to the cemetery. I believe this was just a little bit north, because we're right now, for those of you who kind of know the area, we're talking around the North Avenue exit from Lakeshore Drive. The LaSalle exit on Lakeshore Drive that leads you to North Avenue.
I hate that exit.
For those of you who just kind of know the area. And so they got additional 12 acres, and this gave them more of an opportunity to kind of section off the grounds. And there were essentially 3 different sections. And then there were subsections in some of those. But there was the main city cemetery, the Jewish cemetery, and the Christian cemetery. Okay. The Jewish cemetery was 4 acres on the northeast edge, while the Christian cemetery was on the southern edge, and then City Cemetery was essentially the rest of it. There was an area of City Cemetery that was a potter's field, so that was kind of blocked off in a different area. And basically similar to today, when you were purchasing a cemetery plot, you're essentially paying for the land that is meant to be used for burial purposes. You can't just if you were to buy a cemetery plot, you're buying the land.
Right.
It's not like you can put a little home there, or trailer,
It,
and live there.
Yeah.
It's very clear in the deed that you're buying it to bury somebody, and that's it.
yeah. That's it. Yeah, you can't back in an RV and start roasting shit in the middle
Yeah,
of the
that's not really acceptable.
That seems fair.
So part of the contract stated its intentional use, and anything else would be a violation of that purchase agreement. And
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
the issue with City Cemetery is that this process was not clear, and there were initially too many cooks in the kitchen trying to figure out the planning for the cemetery.
Oh dear.
People weren't going there to like live, but people didn't understand that you needed to purchase land to then bury your loved one. So everyone knew that like this is a cemetery, but they're like, oh, our family member died. I guess let's just go up to City Cemetery and we can bury him.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like okay, let's just go find a spot. Yeah,
Because
I mean,
this was a public
cemetery.
cemetery. Like people didn't understand the process. And
I mean, I get it. It's
mid
37 or
1850s.
yeah, mid 1850s. Yeah, I would probably think the same thing.
Yeah, like I
well,
can't
just
blame them.
yeah, somebody just bought the farm. Let's go over to City Cemetery. I mean, that's what they said. That's where they said we should put dead people.
Exactly. And
That seems fair.
there were many instances when the city sexton, who's basically the person who's in charge of the operations of the cemetery, they're in charge of grave digging and the maintenance and all of that sort of stuff at the cemetery. They would go dig a hole for a casket and end up finding another body there.
Ugh.
It's like, oh, who are
Can
you?
imagine? Like, oh god. Hold on, wait a minute.
And part of the issue with all of this as well is record keeping wasn't a requirement until 1851.
Oh,
So there was
dear.
like a decade there
Yeah.
where records just weren't kept in the early years of the cemetery.
Yeah, it's just the wild, wild west cemetery of Chicago.
Yeah, so you can imagine the complications that kind of came out of this.
Yeah.
And within the first few years of the new city cemetery, Chicago would experience a cholera outbreak. And the first case was reported in September of 1848. And it understandably terrified Chicagoans. Some Chicagoans chose to leave the city, but there was such an influx of immigrants coming in that the population was still increasing at a drastic rate, similar to what we were talking about with the fire.
Yeah.
But due to the cholera outbreak, the death rate rose by 300% from the previous year.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, Chicago would be suffering this outbreak for years. And it would come in waves. Chicago would have a couple months of a lot of death and tragedy due to the cholera. And then it would have a few months without it. And everything was kind of back to normal. And by the summer of 1852, Chicago would see another terrible outbreak that lasted longer than any of the rest. This time, the outbreak lasted for 4 months. And after the outbreak, Chicago thought that cholera was in the past. But a year later, in 1853, thought it was in the past. In 1853, continued without an outbreak. City grew faster. Just kind of like everything was in the past for them. But unfortunately, June of 1854, they saw another outbreak. But due to the city's growth, city officials didn't want this to really hit the news, and they were trying to hide the information from the public.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So according to Pamela Banos' research, 60 people a day were dying of cholera. And by June of 1854, were dying of cholera by June of 1854. And by the end of July, an estimated of 931 people had died in Chicago during that outbreak in that month.
Wow.
Yeah. So not all of these deaths are necessarily related to cholera. because these are kind of just deaths in general. But it's an
Sure.
estimated that at least 2/3 of them were.
Wow.
So a very large majority of the 931 people had died from cholera.
Yeah.
And deaths were happening so rapidly that they were struggling to keep up the record keeping, let alone the burials. Like all of it combined, they just couldn't keep up with.
Yeah.
Luckily, by November of 1854, the cholera outbreak would actually be over for Chicago.
Okay.
So it took a while,
Oof,
and
yeah.
a lot of this was because scientists just didn't understand cholera, and
Sure,
the
yeah.
outbreak, like once they figured out that you were suffering from the cholera outbreak, it would be such a short period of time before death, and they didn't know how to counteract it or treat it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why so many deaths were attributed to the cholera outbreaks.
Yeah, yeah. I remember looking into a little bit of that when I was doing Bellevue, but I was mostly looking at New York numbers.
Right.
And I was really kind of skating over the top. Like, this is very specific. Excuse me.
Yeah. And there is actually, I didn't go into it in my script at all here. There actually was a hospital on the south end of the cemetery grounds, essentially, or bordering the grounds, that
Makes sense.
was for like treating the cholera outbreak. And so I'm like, I could probably do a whole separate episode just on that place, but I'm like, you just talked about Bellevue recently, so I have a lot of other things I can talk about. I will go in that direction.
Yeah.
So the cemetery is filling up fast at this time, and record keeping isn't up to par. So this came some great opportunity for resurrectionists, or commonly known as grave robbers. Most grave robbers at the time were medical students who needed a cadaver for class. And at this time, it was very difficult for medical schools to get their hands on bodies because of different laws at the time. Like it was very difficult for them to get access to them without having to spend a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it wasn't uncommon to have medical students or professors go and dig up a freshly buried body for their class. And as you can imagine, this is highly illegal. But those who were not wanting to take that risk themselves would hire people commonly known as resurrectionists who would go do it for them for a high fee.
Sure. Yeah.
And like if you were to look into oh god, what's their name? There's two guys in England. I think they're in England. Maybe they were in Scotland.
Oh, I know exactly who
Burke,
you're talking
something
about.
in Burke.
Yes, Burke and oh gosh,
I
it
don't
started
remember
with
the other
H.
person's name.
Morbid.
Yeah, they covered
Morbid
it
did an episode on
not
them.
terribly long ago, I feel like.
Not too long ago. Yeah, I definitely. It was like
They
Burke
would-
and Hair or something.
Yeah,
like
something
that.
like that. But they would they started as resurrectionists and then they eventually turned to just killing people
Yeah.
and selling
Yeah.
their bodies. But even like
Yeah.
you look into H.H. Holmes, another Chicago story, they'll talk
Yeah.
about resurrectionists with him. So this was not an uncommon practice by any means.
Not at all.
Still highly illegal, but uncommon.
Yes. Yeah.
And bodies were in such high demand due to the constant advancements in medicine at the time that these resurrectionists were
Right.
able to charge a lot for each cadaver. So it became a very lucrative business, but it was a very dangerous business to also be in. And the issue of grave robbing and resurrectionists have gotten so bad that the city actually decided to hire Alan Pinkerton, who is the founder of Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which does still exist today. I think it's often more commonly known by its parent company, Securitas.
Yep.
But any of you who are into historical true crime, you are very familiar with Pinkerton National Detective Agency.
You said when you said Pinkerton, I was like, "Oh no, somebody's in trouble."
Right? Well, this was one of their
They called
first
Pinkerton.
cases, really, because they're based out of Chicago. There's some dispute on when they actually started as a company, because if you were to ask Pinkerton, it's quite a few years before records show. So who really knows? He could be doing stuff off book.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
who really
maybe
knows?
their records didn't keep up, just like the bodies.
Yeah.
Who knows?
But they would actually, Pinkerton would end up catching a couple of resurrectionists that made very big news in 1857. And Pinkerton was hired because city officials believed that the city sexton, Martin Quinlan, whose job was to essentially manage the cemetery, was a resurrectionist. Or allowed them to come in and rob graves. So they thought there was like an inside job going on, so they hired this private agency to take part in it. And part of Martin Quinlan's job, he actually had the right to arrest resurrectionists. So when he's on cemetery property, in his job, he could arrest people who were grave robbing. But if he's doing it himself, obviously conflict of interest here. But because of this ability to arrest, he actually had a good relationship with a lot of police. So city officials were really worried that police might also be involved with Martin Quinlan. Again, which is why they chose to hire Pinkerton versus get local authorities involved.
Okay, that makes sense.
So in late October of 1857, Pinkerton and his team of 7 men, which some days it was 7 men because they did these different stakeouts every night for quite a while, but it was a maximum of 7 men when he had them available.
Okay.
But they surveilled the cemetery and Quinlan for weeks. Started in like mid to late October of 57, and this went into the first week of November.
Okay.
And just a side note through my research that I discovered, and why detectives use the term stakeout. I didn't see this like confirmed of like, yes, this is the reason why, but it just like clicked in my head and I thought it was fascinating. And it's because of Pinkerton.
Really?
Yes, it was very interesting to me. So obviously these 7 men is not a whole lot of people to cover a full cemetery. Like the cemetery wasn't massive, but like that's not a lot of people. And they needed to be able to communicate with each other across the cemetery silently because they're on a stakeout. They can't let other people know that they're there watching them.
Right.
And so they would actually put stakes in the ground, and they had this, they call it a chalk line, which is basically like a rope, a very small rope or twine covered in chalk.
Yeah, very thin.
Yeah. It's used a lot in construction. And they would tie this chalk line to these stakes and like kind of wrap it around all over the cemetery. And these men would tug on the line and essentially use like a Morse code system tugging on this line to communicate back and forth with each other. And so that's why I'm like, they're putting stakes in the ground and they're communicating with, is that why it's called a stakeout? Like that totally makes sense in my head.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, they had this whole communication system back and forth. And, like, one guy would start it at one end, and it was like a game of telephone, essentially, because he'd pull on it, and the next guy would feel the tugs, and he'd have to repeat that to the next guy. And it just, like, went down the chain.
Down the line,
yeah. So I just thought that was really interesting. And so I'm just like, I have to include that little fun fact.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, the article I read that talked about that didn't mention that that's how it was named, but I'm like, this has to be it, right?
Yeah. There's no way. Yeah. No, I'm with you.
Well, that makes so much sense. Like, why else use the term?
Yeah. That can't be a coincidence.
So on November 6th, so now this has been a few weeks at this point,
Right.
Pinkerton only had 4
Right.
men available that night for the stakeout, and they wanted to keep an eye on the cemetery, and obviously they also want to keep an eye on Quinlan. But it seemed like he wasn't necessarily around that evening. Maybe he just wasn't working or something. It didn't really clarify.
Right.
But they start their shifts typically around 10 p.m. And when they arrived, they actually saw some wagon tracks kind of in this general, it was kind of like the southwest area of the cemetery. Am I wrong? Nope. Oh, they stationed at the northwest corner of the cemetery, kind of near North Ave, because they saw some wagon tracks in this area when they arrived. And
Right.
that kind of just like set off like some signals to them, like, is somebody here that shouldn't be? Like, why is someone
Right.
taking a wagon through the cemetery at night?
Right.
And
It's a little odd.
yeah, exactly. So like we need to keep an eye on this. This is our focus spot for the night. And it turns out that there were grave robbers actually already in the cemetery when their shift started at 10 p.m. And they didn't notice these guys right away. They actually noticed them when they were leaving. And this was around 11:30 that night. And they were in their buggy. So they followed the buggy. And it's actually described because Pinkerton was notorious for taking very detailed notes. And so I actually got to read his notes for this.
Ooh.
And in the notes, he's talking about how like they were trying to silently follow, that they were like rolling on the ground to like make sure they were constantly out of like eye shot of this buggy, but still following it. So
Yeah.
they went all out to follow it and not get spotted. So they followed it out of the cemetery, and eventually they were actually able to stop the buggy by pulling on its axle. And the way that they ended up pulling on it somehow shifted the horse's harness. And that made it so the buggy had to stop, and somebody in the buggy had to get out and fix the harness.
Okay.
So that's exactly what happened. Somebody gets out, starts to fix the harness, and as the door opens on the buggy, the 2 detectives immediately smell human decay. So there's clearly bodies inside of
The buggy. Yeah.
And so this person gets out. So they approach this person. It is Martin Quinlan. Like, it was him. And so that's why they didn't spot him at the cemetery that night, because he was purposely like trying to hide and dig up these bodies.
Oh my gosh.
So it was discovered that 4 bodies were dug up that night. And there were actually 2 of them in that buggy. There were also 2 other men in that buggy. So they approach Quinlan, and they're starting to arrest him. They're like calling him by name and trying to in that moment apprehend him. But I think this startled the horse, and the horse actually backed up, and one of the investigators' legs got caught in the wheel of the buggy.
Oh no.
And the 2 men inside kind of took this as their opportunity to just run. So they jumped out, they bolted. Quinlan also ran. And so in that moment, the 3 men that they're trying to get are gone.
Oh gosh.
And I'm not even reading my notes because this is just such a fun story. I memorized it.
No, you're kind of like right around here.
Okay. Thank you for keeping track, because this is just fun.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
just
no.
talking.
No, it's fascinating.
Luckily, later that night, Quinlan would actually be found on his way home. Like, he just like, okay, I'm going to go home now. See y'all.
He's like, okay, I'm going to run until the cops can't see me anymore, and then I'm going to walk home.
Exactly. The unfortunate thing is, these other 2 men that were inside the buggy, police have no idea who they were.
Oh yeah.
They knew Quinlan by
Just
name
got
because
help.
they were purposely watching him.
Right, looking for him.
Exactly. So the next morning, Pinkerton and its detectives are trying to figure out who these men were. And they had this brilliant idea to just get back in the buggy that was left behind with the bodies in it and let the horse that was leading it just take them. Like, not direct the horse anywhere, just let it naturally go wherever it wants to go. And the horse took them to a stable. There, detectives talked to the owner of the stable, gave the description of the men that they saw that the night before. And the owner is like, oh, yeah, I know who you're looking for. This one guy rented the horse for me last night. Like, yeah, here you go. Here's his information.
Yeah, here you go.
So detectives at this point were able to arrest one of Quinlan's accomplices. His name is Eli York. And he was actually a medical student. So it all kind of just makes sense why he's trying to do this.
Yeah, that all tracks, yep.
And both men were taken to trial for this. And at one point during the trial, there was an argument between Quinlan and York's lawyer and one of Pinkerton's lawyers. And this actually resulted in a fist fight in the courtroom.
Oh!
And the Chicago Daily Times wrote an article about it in 1857. And I'm going to read you an excerpt of this article because it's fantastic.
I can't wait.
It said, "At this moment, the indictments flew from the legal gentleman's hand in every direction, and his fist made a singularly rapid forward movement towards the other party's nose. The other party dodged the blow and was about to return it in kind when the medical student went in on the other party's anatomy. Mr. Sheriff," shrieked the court, as the coattail of a portly individual disappeared through the door. "Police," shouted the state's attorney. Upon one, "Take 'em off," brawled the spectators. At a critical juncture, the policeman jumped from somewhere in the crowd and seized the belligerent attorney by the collar. "You're my prisoner," he screamed, tugging and pulling with all of his might to get the man off. That ended the fight.
Oh,
Imagine
man.
reading that in your paper.
Oh, man. You're like, what the hell is going on?
Right?
Great day in the morning. What is happening?
Also, why are articles not written like that anymore? That's fantastic.
I know. Listen to that. Like, his fist made a rapid movement forward toward the other party's nose.
So, yeah, that didn't go well in court.
No, it didn't go well.
But in the end, it didn't end up terribly for either one of them. Charges would be dropped against medical student Eli York, and Martin Quinlan would only be fined $500. So $500 is obviously a ton of money, but
yeah,
he's not going to prison.
Yeah, no, he's not serving any time or anything.
But yeah, I'm like, I have to include
we
that.
know it was
that
dropped.
fight is too fun.
Yeah, no, it's too good. It's too good. Anytime there's a fist fight in the courtroom, you don't just leave that out.
Right. So by the end of the 1850s, private cemeteries were beginning to open all around Chicago. And the first one was Rose Hill Cemetery, which is up on the northern end of the city at that point. At this point, they really wanted to push the cemetery a lot further out because the city was growing so fast that it was actually becoming very populated around the cemetery.
Yeah, just like it is today.
Exactly. Now it's the park, but they wanted it to be as far out as it could because they didn't want that to disturb the residents.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of concerns at this point of Chicago City Cemetery, and one of the biggest concerns being how sanitary it is. Dr. John H. Rausch was concerned with the gases that corpses release might be seeping through the earth and essentially poisoning anyone. living close to the cemetery. He was trying to just kind of figure out, like, what are the real health concerns to people who are living next to it.
Right.
And he was also really concerned with the proximity of the bodies to the lake. Because obviously this is very, very close to Lake Michigan.
It's on Lake Michigan, essentially.
Yeah, we're at the water level. And so burying the bodies actually puts them below that water line. And Dr. Rausch was worried that water runoff from the cemetery could be contaminating the water supply in the lake. So obviously,
and
that's bad.
I get why the concerns would probably be so big, given that like cholera has just swept the city not that long ago.
Exactly.
And this would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and like I think
I don't know if it's true, but Dr. Rausch probably was like, huh.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a whole lot of scientific standing behind the gases being emitted from the corpse. I honestly, I just don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, same with you. I was like, huh.
But
I get why he's like interesting.
Yeah, but I totally get the runoff idea. That makes a whole lot of sense to me.
Yeah, especially if there are already concerns and like the sexton's been arrested for grave digging. I can see why you might be a little concerned.
Yeah. And so this was another reason why they really wanted to get the cemeteries far out of the city, is because of potential health risks. Not just because it wasn't necessarily pretty. Even though, you ask me, I think a cemetery is beautiful, but
exactly.
A lot of people think I'm
you
weird
and
for
I
that.
Are like, that'd be great.
Right? I've lived next to a cemetery before, and I loved it.
Quiet neighbors.
When I was in college, we had a cemetery on campus, and my dorm room viewed the cemetery, and I loved it.
That's fantastic.
Oh my God, I loved it so much.
That is so awesome.
So another reason the city wanted to move the cemetery was because they wanted a park by the lake. By then, it was 1862, and it was also discovered, kind of in all of this, that the 12 acres that were acquired early on in the operations of the cemetery, when they were trying to expand, were actually illegally acquired.
Oh.
Yes. So this is all of this is happening at once. Being concerned with the health conditions, the city wanting to create a park, and then now these 12 acres are now going into legal action. And this again went to the Supreme Court.
Wow.
And the city eventually was given two options: to pay $75,000 to the estate of the original owners, or return the land.
Yeah, well,
Like,
those sound both right.
yeah, like that was the outcome. And so the city actually decided to give back the land, because they're already in this debate of wanting to move to a different location. And so this was just kind of a catalyst in all of that. And obviously they can't give the land back with all the bodies still there. So they had to exhume 1,635 bodies before they could return the land. And in Pamela's research, she had discovered that there was the potential of 5,232 bodies on that land. So, did they return the land with 4,000 bodies still there?
Yeah.
None of us may ever know.
Yeah. When did you return it? Oh, no.
Yeah. Like, there's documented exhumations of 1,635. And that's according to records of what could have been there. But given the fact that we already know that, like, people just buried their family members, the amount of space available would have been over 5,000 graves.
Yeah.
So it's like, could there be a lot of
Woo!
undocumented people that were there that their families just put there? Or
Yeah.
like what happened?
Yeah, what happened here? Hold
Yeah,
on.
so we don't know. Maybe. Maybe.
Perhaps.
So regardless, having to clear portions of this land, some the sanitary concerns, and wanting to turn it into the park, this would lead to them completely wanting to move City Cemetery and create this park, and they actually initially named it Cemetery Park. But just about a year after this, Lincoln was assassinated, and so the city decided to rename it Lincoln Park.
I see why.
Right.
I really like
Although
the
I like
first
Cemetery
name,
Park.
though. Yeah, I really like the first name. Can you imagine
Right.
today, like, what neighborhood do you want to move to? Definitely the Cemetery Park neighborhood.
I probably would move there for that reason.
Probably. I'd be like, sure.
I can't afford to live in Lincoln Park, but I would.
I mean, I'm here right now, and all I know is that I walk my dog in that park every day.
Right.
And so now I'm like, how are there not more people there with metal detectors? Because we're missing 4,000 people.
Oh, just wait. We might be missing a whole lot more.
Oh, no.
So by this time, multiple private cemeteries were opening outside the city, and the city worked out a plan specifically with Rose Hill, potentially the other cemeteries as well, because there were two others at the time. But Rose Hill is kind of the one that we'll focus on the most.
Yeah.
And there was documentation that the city, even though it's a private cemetery, they just worked out a deal with them so that they could offer affordable plots for families that didn't have a lot of money to pay for those bigger, fancier plots, or people that didn't have any resources, like didn't have family or anything, like a potter's field or something like that. And it sounds like this didn't last long. I never saw any like real dates or prices of any of that. But in Pamela's notes, she just kind of says that like that went away quickly.
Yeah.
And one thing that I found very interesting is that the disinterment was like an absolute mess.
Oh no.
Families were in charge of moving their own loved ones, so they had to pay for it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So
And they had to do it. Like they were like, okay, well, we gotta round up those last few families and be like, hey, is Grandpa's body out of there yet?
right. Yeah. And so like it became really difficult because also there wasn't early on record keeping. So it's like you need to contact these families and tell them like you need to pay this and move. And like this isn't cheap either, which is one reason they wanted to try to get Rose Hill to kind of give discounts to people. And there was just no order to when and where a lot of the bodies were buried because as we were mentioning earlier, people would just like bury their loved ones without documentation or buying the plot. And it just became an absolute mess. And then there were those who at City Cemetery didn't have family or had family with no money that could do anything to help them. And so at that point, both City Cemetery, like city officials, and funding along with the private cemeteries would have to kind of like combined and foot the bill for that sort of stuff, which obviously neither of them wanted to do.
Yeah.
And according to records, the removal of the bodies was completed by 1877. But there are records that are showing into the mid 1880s that people were still paying for disinterments. So that very much confused me Um,
Yeah, so it's like either they kept going until the mid 1880s or they had people on payment plans so
I'm
they
kind
didn't
of thinking a
record.
payment plan thing, but honestly, I couldn't find that out.
Right, yeah, I was going to say that might not be another well-kept record, you know?
Yeah. And one thing that we do know is like as they were digging people up in these disinterments, they were finding other bodies. So like I don't know, it seems really weird. And one reason that they're finding all these
Right.
bodies as well. So we already talked about the fact that people would just bury their loved ones there and there'd be no records. Also, when the Chicago fire came through, it ruined a ton of the headstones.
Yeah.
So it's either the headstone was completely gone or it was so damaged that it was indecipherable. But that also made it incredibly hard to know where people were buried to dig them up.
Yeah. Right.
So, like,
Oh
there's the
God.
potential that there were a lot of people who were left behind because they didn't know that they were there or they couldn't find them.
Right. Oh God.
Yeah. So, the process we believe took about 20 years moving all of the bodies from city cemetery to other
Wow.
cemeteries. If we're going by those payment
Okay.
records, it could be additional 10 years. We don't really know.
Maybe, yeah. Yeah.
And it seems like Lincoln Park was just about ready to become Lincoln Park. And they received word that the disinterments were completed, but in certain areas, they were still seeing headstones. And so they're just thinking that like they're left behind. And so the park cleared up the headstones. But in reality, it's actually unclear if bodies were still buried in those areas. And then if you're moving the
Oh.
headstones, you never know.
Right. Yeah.
So as early as 1870, many years before the disinterments would be so and so complete, the Chicago Tribune was actually reporting that there were bodies being left behind. Like this
Everybody's
became
already all over
common
this. Like,
news.
wait. Yeah.
And then let's jump ahead to 1962, like 100 years after all of this.
Right.
When they were building the barn for the Lincoln Park Zoo, when digging in the foundation, they found remains. So clearly, there were some people left behind.
Clearly, yeah.
Even as recently as 2008, believed to have found remains. And in 2010 as well.
Ah.
Yeah. So Pamela Banos put together a map of places that she believes there could still be remains. And Kelly, I have it for you in my script here. Each yellow dot she believes could have remains there. And we'll post this on our
That's
Instagram so
really
you all can see as well. There's a lot of yellow dots.
Oh, wow, yeah. There are a lot of yellow dots. Yeah, and they're all sort of in toward that southern area.
Yes.
So I can see why when they were digging a foundation for the zoo, they were like, "Oh, what?"
Yeah, well, that southern area is actually, that's not technically Lincoln Park, like the park proper anymore. That's actually a neighborhood.
Yeah, it is. I see the buildings.
Yeah.
There are tons of yellow dots over buildings, you guys. Like, this is where it's fully built out around the zoo. Like, when we say zoo, you might think that, like, oh, big space of land, kind of sort of in the city, but a little out. Like, no, zoo is like right in the middle.
Yeah, the zoo
Of the
in this
neighborhood.
photo is like just north of where
Yeah.
this photo cuts off. But in that where the neighborhood is, where the majority of the yellow dots are, that I believe was the Catholic cemetery. And
Oh, okay.
the Catholic cemetery and the Jewish cemetery,
didn't do-
they were responsible for their own disinterments. So the city was just
was
basically
gonna
like,
say,
you guys
we,
figure it out. We gave you guys this land, or you purchased this land for the people who attend your church. You deal with it.
Right.
Um,
Right. And it looks like we didn't do a bang up job. By the number
Yeah.
of yellow dots, we'll show you guys. You'll see.
Yeah, we'll definitely have this posted on Instagram. And like I said, I'm going to have Pamela's website linked. There's so much on there. Please go check it out. It's so cool.
Yeah.
But let's bring this all around and let's get back to our original topic, the couch tomb.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason the couch tomb was left behind is still unknown. But
Okay.
Pamela offers 3 reasons why she believes it was left behind. Ira and his family's political connections is the first one.
Mm-hmm.
We know Ira was a very wealthy businessman. Could his tomb have been allowed to stay due to his business dealings? Maybe. I don't really know.
Yeah. Maybe.
Second reason is no one wanted to pay to move it,
No,
which is huge.
yeah.
It's very large. I'm not sure if
It
you've
is
ever
big.
noticed
It's
it,
big.
Kelly.
I think it's like ringing bells in my head that I've absolutely 100% passed it millions of times. So
You
I
could
just
see
have
it
to
when
keep
you're on
my
the
eye
Sal,
out.
making that like
Yeah,
curvy
okay, then I
turn
passed it.
onto North.
Okay, well then the reason I haven't seen it is because I'm having a panic attack in
So
my
that's an
car
awful
at the
area.
LaSalle exit.
It's an awful area
Yeah,
to
it's
drive in.
terrible. Yeah, for you guys who don't live here, all you need to know is it is wretched. It sucks.
Yeah, it's not fun
Terrible
to drive
highway
there.
exit. Yeah, good place to put a tomb, maybe. Bad place to put a highway exit.
Yeah, it's very large though. And one thing I'm not entirely sure about is how many people had as large of a tomb as him. My
Yeah.
gut feeling is not
Yeah.
many because of how much money was spent on
Right.
it.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we said $250,000
In like modern day money. Yeah.
in modern day. Yeah, in modern day. Dang.
Yeah, it's a lot of
Yeah,
money.
There's not that many people. That's a lot of money.
But it kind of makes sense. And also knowing that the Ira's family after his death basically had to spend all of his money fixing
Right.
his properties after the Chicago fire, and the lawsuits were playing out all at that time of the disinterments, that maybe they just truly couldn't
okay.
afford it. That's entirely possible.
Yeah, because we know his family was essentially left with nothing. And it's a huge, gigantic mausoleum.
Exactly. Yep. And so then the third reason, which I kind of love, and I hope this is the reason, is to basically be a memorial to the cemetery itself.
I like that.
Yeah, like,
That'd be a good idea.
because that's Chicago's history. Like, why not leave
Yeah.
something grand and beautiful behind?
Yeah, exactly. Maybe they just thought, like, this already looks really, yeah, like you said, grand and beautiful. And I mean, it cost enough to be grand and beautiful.
Right, exactly.
Better be.
But that is really kind of all we have today for Ira Couch and the Chicago City Cemetery. Do you have any additional thoughts, Kelly?
Man, I know how you ended up down the rabbit hole.
I had
on
so
this
much
one.
fun doing this one.
Oh, this is I could spend all day thinking about this, talking about this. I probably will spend all day.
Check out
And
Pamela's website. It's
Pamela's
truly
yeah.
incredible, the work that she's done.
I was gonna say I'll probably report directly to Pamela's website.
So you do not know how hard it was for me to be like, I can't include this. Our episode will be 5 hours if I do.
know.
But I
I
need to
hate
read
when
it.
That happens. Yeah, exactly. You're like, but it's part of the yeah. That's how Bellevue was for me, because there's just so many records and so much stuff that you're like, I want to pack this all in, but also I don't want everyone to be sitting here for 3 hours.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you all for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can follow our show on Spotify. And you can find us on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, on TikTok at HYHATC, or you can email us at haveyouheardaboutThisCase@gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.
Bye.